In 1965, the Prime Minister of a brand new country sat down in front of a television camera and cried. Not because he had won, because he had lost. Singapore had just been expelled from Malaysia, kicked out, told it was too small, too Chinese, too complicated to keep. Lee Kuan Yew looked into that camera and said, and these are his exact words, "For me, it is a moment of anguish." The country he was now responsible for had no army, no navy, no air force, no natural resources, no clean water supply of its own, an unemployment rate pushing 14%, and 581 square kilometers of land, smaller than the city of London. What happened next is one of the most studied and least understood transformations in modern history. To understand what Singapore pulled off, you need to understand how impossible the starting conditions were. The island sits at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. It has no oil, no minerals, no agricultural land worth mentioning, and critically, no fresh water. The entire country depended on a single pipeline from Malaysia for its water supply. That dependency was a political weapon Malaysia used openly. Its neighbors were hostile, larger, and unstable. Indonesia had just gone through a violent communist purge. Malaysia was navigating ethnic tensions that had already sparked deadly riots. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was roughly $500, similar to Ghana at the time. Lee Kuan Yew understood something most leaders don't, that vulnerability, if engineered correctly, can become leverage. He had one asset. The Strait of Malacca runs directly past Singapore. At its narrowest point, it is less than 2 miles wide. 40% of the world's maritime trade passes through it. Every ship moving between Europe and Asia, between the Middle East and the Pacific, all of it moves past Singapore. That was the foundation. Geography was the only card on the table. Everything else had to be built. The first priority was defense. Singapore was surrounded by countries with armies. It had none. Lee Kuan Yew flew to Israel. He studied how a small, surrounded nation had built a military force that could deter enemies far larger than itself. Within 2 years, Singapore implemented mandatory national service for every male citizen. Today, Singapore fields one of the most technologically advanced militaries in Southeast Asia, with a defense budget larger than Malaysia's, despite being 1/5 the size. The second priority was removing corruption entirely. This sounds obvious. No government says it wants corruption. But Singapore did something no one else had done. It paid its civil servants' salaries pegged to the private sector. Ministers in Singapore earn more than the U.S. president. The logic was simple. If you pay people well, you remove the financial incentive to steal. Corruption dropped to near zero. It has stayed there. The third priority was housing. In 1960, most of Singapore's population lived in slums. The Housing Development Board was created to build government housing, not to rent, but to sell, at subsidized prices. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans own the home they live in. That home has appreciated dramatically in value over decades. The government created a middle class by giving people an asset. The fourth priority was education. Singapore redesigned its school system from the ground up, with a focus on math, science, and English as the primary language of instruction. Today, Singapore consistently ranks first or second in global education assessments. By 1990, Singapore's GDP per capita had risen from $500 to over $12,000. By 2000, it crossed $23,000. Today, it sits above $65,000, higher than the United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan. The Port of Singapore handles over 37 million shipping containers per year. It is one of the 2 busiest ports on Earth. Singapore became the financial hub of Southeast Asia, and then of Asia broadly. Its stock exchange, its banking sector, its legal system, all built to attract global capital. Hedge funds, family offices, and sovereign wealth funds from across the world now base regional operations in Singapore. The water problem was solved too. Singapore developed one of the most advanced water recycling and desalination systems in the world. It now produces enough water to be largely self-sufficient and exports water technology globally. All of this in under 60 years, one generation. The Singapore model is not without its critics. Lee Kuan Yew's government was authoritarian. Press freedom was tightly controlled. Political opposition was systematically weakened. Chewing gum was banned. Fines for minor infractions were steep and enforced. Lee Kuan Yew's answer to these criticisms was direct. He argued that the Western model of liberal democracy assumes a foundation of stable institutions, educated populations, and established rule of law that developing nations often don't have. Singapore, he argued, needed discipline before freedom, order before rights. Whether that trade-off was worth it is a question Singapore's citizens are still navigating. The country has slowly liberalized over time, but the architecture of control Lee Kuan Yew built remains embedded in its institutions. This tension between engineered prosperity and political freedom is the unresolved question at the center of the Singapore story. What Singapore actually demonstrates is that the constraints a country faces are not fixed. No water became a desalination and recycling industry. No army became one of the most professional militaries in the region. No resources became a services economy that outperformed resource-rich neighbors. Dependency on a single trade route became the defining economic advantage. Every weakness was converted. That conversion required a government willing to make long-term decisions over short-term popularity, and a population willing to accept short-term discipline for long-term gain. Whether you agree with how they did it or not, the results exist. They are measurable, and no serious economist disputes them. An island that was told it couldn't survive alone became one of the wealthiest, most stable, and most strategically important nations on Earth. Lee Kuan Yew died in 2015. His last book was titled One Man's View of the World. In it, he wrote, "I have never been over-concerned with popularity. My job was to do what was right for Singapore." Next on Grounded Intel, the country that has no military, no enemies, and some of the world's most powerful diplomatic leverage. Subscribe so you don't miss it.